Good evening. This is Forum Daily for Monday, August 15th. I'm Nathaniel Dueck, filling in for Nima Rajan. We start this evening's newscast in Ottawa, where the federal government is facing criticism for its handling of the resettlement of Afghan refugees. New Democrat MP Jenny Kwan says there's a stark difference between the federal government's treatment of those fleeing the Taliban and those fleeing the Russian invasion of Ukraine. A year after the Taliban seized control of Kabul, Canada has resettled 17,300 Afghans, not the 40,000 the government promised. But since just the start of this year, government statistics show that 71,800 Ukrainians have come to Canada. Canadian activists are accusing the Liberals of not doing enough to help the people who worked with the Canadian forces, including as interpreters. Home sales in Canada fell for a fifth month in a row in July. But the Canadian Real Estate Association says the 5.3% drop between June and July was the smallest of the five declines. The average sales price fell 5% from just a year earlier to just under $630,000. The latest national rent report shows the cost of renting in Ontario rose more than almost every other province across the country last month. The report, released last week by Rentals.ca and Bullpen Research and Consulting, shows rents in Ontario experienced a 3.1% monthly increase in July and a 15.2% increase annually. The new national analysis of online listings has found the province ranks second when it comes to the highest average rent prices in July for all types of housing. The only province that surpassed Ontario was British Columbia, with a 19% year-over-year increase. While manufacturing sales fell 0.8% to $71.8 billion in June. The decline follows a 1.1% drop in May. Sales fell in 8 of the 21 industries that Statistics Canada tracks. The steepest decline came in the petroleum and coal product sector, which recorded a 7.8% drop in sales. Quebec Auditor General Ghislaine Leclerc says the finance minister's forecasts for this fiscal year, as well as the next two, are plausible. And Madame Leclerc is warning that nothing can be taken for granted for the years to come because of rising inflation, the war in Ukraine, and pandemic-related disruptions. Her review ahead of this October's provincial election is intended to ensure that political parties have accurate information on which to base their platforms and can't claim to be surprised by an unexpected deficit or surplus after the vote. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney is slamming a plan by a United Conservative leadership candidate by labeling it as, quote, nuts. On his province-wide radio show, Mr. Kenney commented on Danielle Smith's pledge that, if elected, she would bring in a bill this fall to give Alberta the power to ignore federal laws and court rulings deemed not in the province's interest. The Premier summed up the idea as, quote, a proposal for Alberta to basically ignore and violate the Constitution in a way unprecedented in Canadian history. Ms. Smith is calling Mr. Kenney's comments ill-informed and disrespectful to UCP members that support the initiative. The Newfoundland and Labrador government says 69% of residents who replied to an online survey were against changing the name of the Colonial Building in downtown St. John's. The Provincial Tourism Department raised the possibility of a name change last fall as part of efforts to support Indigenous reconciliation. But the government now says that will not happen. The neoclassical building that dates to 1850 first housed the colonial government, then the provincial legislature, for the first 10 years after Newfoundland joined Canada in 1949. BC's Wildfire Service is predicting more stable weather this week after days of high lightning activity. The spokesman says there were nearly 1,800 lightning strikes between Wednesday and Saturday, which caused over 100 fires to ignite across the province. The service says it was well prepared, and 69% of those fires ignited by the strikes were classified as out, under control, or being held as of Sunday night. Well, as this is happening, Nova Scotia is sending about 20 firefighters to central Newfoundland. Wildfires have been burning there for more than 2 weeks. On Saturday, Newfoundland officials said some fires remain out of control near the Bay d'Espoir Highway, Paradise Lake, and Great Rattling Brook. The state of emergency was lifted on Saturday because the fires are not threatening communities or highways. Well, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has appointed a former Liberal MP, Anita Neville, to serve as Manitoba's next Lieutenant Governor. Ms. Neville will be the first Jewish person and the third woman to hold the position. Mr. Trudeau says she has long been a champion for the people of her community, her province, and the country. Forum Daily will be right back after the break with a conversation on the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan a year after the U.S. withdrawal. We'll speak with Mr. Bill Roggio, Senior Managing Editor for the Foundation for Defense Democracies Long War Journal. Stay with us. We'll be right back. The Taliban are marking 1 year since they seized the Afghan capital of Kabul. The rapid takeover triggered a hasty escape of the nation's Western-backed leaders, sent the economy into a tailspin, and has fundamentally transformed the country. On Monday, Taliban victory parades were reported around Kabul. A year after that dramatic day, much has changed in Afghanistan. The former insurgents struggle to govern and remain internationally isolated. The economic downturn has driven millions more Afghans into poverty and even hunger, as the flow of foreign aid slows to a trickle. With us to discuss the situation is Mr. Bill Roggio, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you very much for having me.
So a year on now, can you remind viewers of the events that led up to the withdrawal from Afghanistan?
Yes, the downfall began with President Trump's decision to negotiate with and cut a deal with the Taliban. It was a terrible deal. This problem is decades in the making. Once President Obama decided that U.S. policy was to essentially leave Afghanistan, U.S. policymakers have been determined to make that happen. President Obama wanted out, President Trump wanted out, and President Biden actually pulled the trigger on that. So this deal greatly weakened the Afghan government and the Afghan military, but it was still salvageable. But President Biden on April 13, 2021 decided to announce the withdrawal. And it wasn't just the fact that he announced that he was leaving. It was the way that the withdrawal was executed. The U.S. left within 3.5 months of the announcement of the withdrawal. There were no plans in place to help prop up the Afghan government, to give it time to adjust to the new realities of life without the United States. The Afghan government essentially needed to reorganize itself. It needed to abandon areas, particularly in the south and east, that were destined to be overrun by the Taliban, and basically set up a rump government, or call it Northern Alliance 2.0, that could have been supported by the U.S. if the U.S. had slow rolled that withdrawal and given the Afghan the time and space that they needed, set up air bases for them, set up the capability for maintenance for the aircraft, which they were wholly dependent on in fighting. There would have been a chance. But President Biden just literally pulled the rug out from the Afghan government and insulted the Afghan government and the Afghan military and the Afghan people in the process, said they were unwilling to fight, things of that nature, which was completely untrue. The Taliban had a plan. They set that plan in motion once the U.S. ended the surge in 2014. And all the conditions were there for them to get a quick end to this. What we witnessed last spring, summer was merely the final nails in the coffin of Afghanistan. But it didn't have to happen like that. President Biden's decision to leave in the manner that he did doomed the Afghans to the fate of being under the thumb of the Taliban.
And building off of that point a little bit, I know the U.S. president had said that a withdrawal was the best case, as the Taliban would no longer harbor terrorists. Now, how does that statement look today? How does that play out, given the killing of the top Al-Qaeda leader in Kabul just recently?
This was a lie, again, given by successive administrations. The Obama administration said that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda alliance was weakened, and Al-Qaeda was decimated, destroyed, defeated, degraded. President Trump, Secretary Mike Pompeo, said that Al-Qaeda or the Taliban would destroy Al-Qaeda. Literally, that's a quote from Mike Pompeo after signing the deal. And President Biden, right before he announced the withdrawal, or after he announced the withdrawal, said Al-Qaeda is done. Literally said that. And there's no reason to be there. And yet, less than a year later, the head of Al-Qaeda is sheltering in Kabul under the protection of one of the two deputy leaders of the Taliban, emirs of the Taliban, who also serves as the group's or the government's interior ministry. There are other Al-Qaeda leaders and operatives there, far more than this administration claims. Al-Qaeda can't be done, and then Al-Qaeda's top leader is sheltering in Kabul under the protection of the Taliban at the same time. We've been misled, or dare I say, lied to by 3 successive administrations. about the strength of Al Qaeda, about its importance, its relationship with the Taliban. And this is how we get what we just witnessed in the past several weeks with the killing of Zawahiri.
And I guess a quick 20 seconds left here, but are there any lessons that Western leaders, US, Canada, can take from the withdrawal of Afghanistan?
Yeah, the lesson should be, if you decide to end the mission, it needs to be thoroughly and thoughtfully planned. You cannot just leave an ally. Afghanistan was a major non-NATO ally, and they were left in the lurch to the predations of the Taliban.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. Roggio. Some challenging words and a challenging time, and we'll definitely keep monitoring the situation in the country as we continue to move on in the future. Again, that was Mr. Bill Roggio from Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
New data released today from think tank secondstreet.org indicates that the number of Ontario patients that died while waiting for surgery, CT scans, and MRI scans has risen significantly over the past 5 years. The largest spike occurred from 2021 to 2022 across all scans and procedures, with over 5,000 patients dying while waiting for a CT scan. Past research suggests that most patients likely died while waiting for procedures meant to improve their quality of life, such as hip and knee replacements, rather than life-saving, such as a heart operation. Many provinces, and even some Ontario hospitals, have released more information about waiting list deaths, but Ontario Health has refused to release similar information. Well, joining us today to discuss this research is Mr. Colin, president of secondstreet.org. Welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Can you give our viewers a brief overview of the recent report that your organization just put out today?
Yeah, so it's it's been known for a number of years in Canada that from time to time patients will die while waiting for surgery and diagnostic scans. And so we've been researching this issue for several years now. And today we released some data that we got from Ontario Health that looks back, depending on what you're looking at, 7 to about 12 years. And it shows a steady increase when it comes to patients dying while waiting for things like MRI scans, CT scans, and even surgery. So it's concerning. Unfortunately, they just give us the big totals. They don't give us a breakdown as to what's actually happening. So for example, in Nova Scotia, when we get the data from them, it shows us for each case, how long patients are waiting, what they're waiting for, and so forth. And they can even dissect just how many patients died while waiting for procedures which could have potentially saved their lives. So something like a heart attack versus something like, or heart surgery rather than something like knee or hip surgery. So Ontario Health, they're not giving us full data there. We certainly hope that they have it somewhere, but we think it's important for them to be accountable and to disclose this information to patients so that people can understand just how much patient suffering is going on.
I suppose from your research, from what you've been able to uncover, would you know what's behind the spike in waiting list deaths in Ontario?
I think really at the heart of this is government mismanagement. When you look at the numbers, you can see they've been increasing for a number of years, well before COVID even hit. It's been a growing problem. And, in this country, we have a long history of just simply politicians throwing more and more money at the healthcare system, hoping it works, without actually reforming things so that things will work better like they do in other countries. And so, that really just hasn't materialized. We've seen more and more spending. We've seen this problem continue to grow and grow and grow. So I think that's really at the root of this problem is just we haven't seen meaningful health reform to improve outcomes for patients. COVID made a bad situation worse. It as governments postponed hundreds of thousands surgeries and diagnostic scans, it just created a huge backlog. So that's been a cause, that's been a problem. And then the other significant factor is that we have an aging population in Canada. And it's just a fact of life that as we get older, we need more and more health services like diagnostic scans and surgeries and so forth. So we've got all these factors competing or contributing to a significant and growing problem.
I know the reports about Ontario it's focused on Ontario, but do you have any comparison or reference for how these numbers in Ontario compare to other provinces across the country?
Yeah, so across the country, we have seen an increase. It does appear to be a growing problem across the country. I would expect that the situation is probably going to get worse because we do have this huge backlog of surgeries and diagnostic scans in the country. Governments are trying to address that as, like I say, we have this aging population, which continues to put more and more strain on the system. So, certainly I hope for the sake of patients that we see some health reform moving forward sooner rather than later, because ultimately that could improve the health outcomes that patients receive from the healthcare system.
You talked a little bit of reforms, and I know Second Street has looked into this in the past. Do you have any recommendations in a quick 30 seconds or more what policymakers could do to address this?
Yeah, I think the first step is to track the data very carefully. A lot of provinces don't do that. There's certainly room for improvement in Ontario. Track it and disclose it. Inform the public. Be accountable about what's going on, especially when it comes to how many patients are dying because they're not getting the care that they need. Governments should absolutely be transparent about that. And once they have that data, that will help show where the problems are, areas are that need to be fixed.
Well, lots to keep in mind, and transparency, of course, a conversation for another interview down the road, perhaps. Mr. Colin Craig of secondstreet.org, thanks for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me.
Well, China has announced more military drills around Taiwan as the self-governing island's president met with members of a new U.S. congressional delegation. The announcement threatened to renew tensions between Beijing and Washington just days after a similar visit by U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi angered China. Ms. Pelosi was the highest-level member of the U.S. government to visit Taiwan in 25 years, and her trip prompted nearly 2 weeks of threatening military exercises by China. Beijing claims Taiwan as its own. The two sides split amid civil war in 1949. Young people in Ukraine's embattled Donetsk region are increasingly retreating to the online world as Russian artillery booms nearby. Classes have been moved online since Russia's invasion, and video games and social media have taken the place of walks and bike rides that children and teens once enjoyed with friends who have since fled. Only 40,000 of the roughly 275,000 children aged 17 or younger in the Donetsk region before Russia's invasion remain, and authorities are urging all remaining families to evacuate immediately. South Korea's president is offering what he calls audacious economic assistance to North Korea if it abandons its nuclear weapons program. Yoon Suk-yeol made the offer in a speech celebrating the end of Japan's colonization of the Korean peninsula. President Yoon avoided harsh criticism of the North days after it threatened retaliation over a COVID-19 outbreak that it blames on South Korea. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi has pledged to raise millions out of poverty and turn India into a developed country in the next quarter century. This as he marked 75 years from independence from British rule. Mr. Modi addressed the country Monday from New Delhi, saying the world was looking toward India to help resolve global issues. In his speech, Mr. Modi said billions of dollars were being invested in the country's future as a manufacturing hub. While China's central bank has trimmed a key interest rate to shore up sagging economic growth at a politically sensitive time when President Xi Jinping is believed to be trying to extend his hold on power. The ruling Communist Party has acknowledged that it can't hit this year's official 5.5% growth target after antivirus curbs disrupted trade, manufacturing, and consumer spending. Government data shows July factory output and retail sales weakened. The rate cut suggests Beijing's worries about rising debt are at least temporarily outweighed by the political dangers of an economic slump and job losses. While an Iranian government official denied on Monday that Tehran was involved in the assault on author Salman Rushdie. But Nasser Kanani also justified the stabbing in the Islamic Republic's first public comments on Friday's attack. While Iran hasn't focused on the writer in recent years, a decades-old fatwa demanding his killing still stands. The 75-year-old Satanic Verses author has been taken off a ventilator and is on the road to recovery, according to his agent. A 24-year-old New Jersey man has pleaded not guilty to charges stemming from the attack. The UK's Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Agency has become the first in the world to authorize an updated version of Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine that aims to protect against the original virus and the Omicron variant. The agency has approved Moderna's combination bivalent vaccine, which will be used as an adult booster shot. On Friday, Germany's health minister said the European Medicines Agency might clear the tweaked COVID-19 booster next month. A new report from Global Witness has found Facebook failed to detect election-related misinformation in ads ahead of Brazil's 2022 election. The group says the company's persisting pattern of not catching material that violates its policies is alarming. The advertisements contained false information about the country's upcoming election, such as promoting the wrong date for the vote and questioning the integrity of the election. It's the fourth such test of Facebook's moderation systems that the human rights group has conducted over the past few months, and it's the fourth one Facebook has flubbed. Well, a mining company is thanking the international community, including the Royal Canadian Air Force, for aiding the recent rescue of 2 trapped miners in the Dominican Republic. Paul Marinko, head of the Dominican Mining Corporation, says Canada played a critical role in transporting the equipment that was used to ultimately liberate the men, who were trapped underground for 10 days. He says experts from the US and the UK were also involved in the operation. Well, I'm Nathaniel Dueck, filling in for Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. For more news on demand, visit our website at thenewsforum.ca and be sure to follow our social media accounts. We are available on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Don't forget, you can also watch all our commentary programming and interviews on the News Forum YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us on Forum Daily today, and we'll be sure to see you next time. Have a great evening.